Welcome to the third podcast. In this podcast, we will cover consumer preferences and the assumptions economists make on this. We will also explain what a utility function is. Say we have two consumption baskets that we want to compare. C is 5 kilos of strawberries and 10 kilos of oranges, and D is 7 kilos of strawberries and 9 kilos of oranges. So C has less strawberries but more oranges than D. How does Jenny rank these two consumption bundles? There are three options. Either she prefers C to D, or she prefers D to C, or she likes C as much as D. In this case, we say that she is indifferent between C and D. One possible ranking according to Jenny is the following. She prefers C to D, she prefers D to A, but she is indifferent between A and B, then she prefers B to E. This ranking can be represented by a function which assigns a higher value to the preferred consumption baskets. Let's call this function U. If we translate the present ranking into values, then we have a greater value assigned to C than D, which means that U of C is greater than U of D, and so on. U of D is greater than U of A has the same value as U of B, and U of B is greater than U of E. This function U is called the utility function, and it represents the consumer's satisfaction derived from good 1 and good 2. This is the function which describes the consumer's preferences. This is an overarching concept in consumer theory. As we saw on the previous slides, the utility function assigns a number to each bundle, but importantly, it does not matter which number is attributed to these baskets. Only the ranking of each basket matters. This refers to the fact that utility function is an ordinal concept by opposition to cardinal, where the numbers matter. Thus, regarding the link between preferences and the utility function, we can say that for any two bundles A and B, the utility derived from basket A is greater than the utility derived from B if and only if Jenny strictly prefers A to B. The utility from basket A is equal to the utility derived from B if and only if Jenny is indifferent between A and B. And finally, the utility from basket B is greater than the utility from A if and only if Jenny strictly prefers B to A. Let's turn to the assumptions economists make on preferences. The first assumption is that preferences are complete. That means that a consumer can compare any two bundles. So either A is preferred to B, or B is preferred to A, or A and B are indifferent to the consumer. The second assumption is that preferences are transitive. This means that if Jenny prefers bundle A to bundle B and bundle B to bundle C, then she must prefer bundle A to bundle C as well. So a consumer has transitive preferences if her preferences are internally consistent. The third assumption of continuity is rather technical than economic, so we won't go through it here. The fourth assumption is the monotonicity or non-satiation of preferences. This means that more is better than less. For example, having 2 units of one good is at least as good as having 1 unit of that good. We can interpret that graphically. Imagine you have point A, which is composed of 3 kilos of strawberries and 2 kilos of oranges. We can divide the graph into 4 zones. In zone 1, All bundles are better than A because they both have more oranges and strawberries. In zone 2, all bundles are less good than A because they both have less oranges and strawberries. In zones 3 and 4, we need a deeper analysis through the specification of the utility function to know whether the bundles are better or worse than A. It is indeed not clear whether a bundle in zone 3, for example, which has more oranges but less strawberries, will be preferred by Jenny compared to bundle A. These 4 assumptions allow us to derive what we call the indifference curves. These curves will allow us to answer the following questions. What are the baskets that give Jenny higher utility than A? In this case, we will look for the quantities x1 and x2 such that the utility derived from x1 and x2 is greater than the utility derived from the bundle A. What are the baskets that give Jenny lower utility than A this time? Here we will look at x1 and x2 such that u of x1 and x2 is smaller than u of A. And what are the baskets that give Jenny the same utility as A? For this case, we will look for x1 and x2 such that the utility of x1 and x2 is equal to the utility of A. Actually, this latter case defines an indifference curve. So, an indifference curve is the set of all consumption bundles that provide the consumer with the same utility level. So, one level of utility corresponds to one indifference curve. Keep that in mind. There are, of course, several indifference curves, and the higher the indifference curve, the higher the satisfaction derived from the consumption bundles, which belong to the curve. So the level of utility U1 is smaller than U2, which is smaller than U3. By the way, why are these indifference curves declining? Remember that one indifference curve corresponds to one level of utility. So there is the same level of utility all along the indifference curve. Now I give you the intuition. Imagine you are endowed with 3 kilos of strawberries and 2 kilos of oranges, which corresponds to point A on utility level U1. If I take 1 strawberry from you, you are less satisfied than at point A, since you are below this indifference curve. So how can I make you reach the same level of utility as before, which is U1? Well, I can give you delta x2 kilos of oranges in exchange. So this is what we call the substitution effect. If I had given you 1 more strawberry, I would have needed to take from you some oranges so that you return to the same utility level. So strawberries and oranges are substitutable to a certain degree, and that makes indifference curves decline. This leads us to one very important concept in consumer theory, the marginal rate of substitution. This is defined as the quantity of good 2 a consumer is willing to sacrifice in order to get 1 more unit of good 1. Formally, this is minus the variation of good 2 over the variation of good 1. And it tells us by how much the quantity of good 2 varies when the quantity of good 1 changes. Graphically, the marginal rate of substitution is the slope of the indifference curve in absolute value. Note that the slope changes along the indifference curve since it is not a linear curve. This means that the marginal rate of substitution decreases as the quantity of good 1 increases. There is another way of writing the marginal rate of substitution. This is the slope of the indifference curve, but along an indifference curve, the variation of utility is 0 since it corresponds to a unique level of utility. So that means that du equals 0. The variation in utility equals 0. Thus, by decomposing du totally, we get that the differential of u with respect to x1 times the variation in x1 plus the differential of u with respect to x2 times the variation of x2 is equal to 0. And by rearranging, we get that the ratio of the differentials that we call marginal utilities is equal to the opposite of the ratio of variations in the quantities of x1 and x2. So the marginal rate of substitution is also equal to the ratio of marginal utilities. And don't forget that it corresponds to the slope of the indifference curve in absolute values. So we went through 4 assumptions on preferences, and here is a 5th one. The convexity assumption on preferences tells us that consumers like diversification. So equivalently, that means that middle bundles are better than extremes. Graphically, that means that for any 2 bundles which provide the same level of utility to the consumer, here A and B, any linear combination of these 2 bundles, like point C, provides the consumer with a higher utility level. So far, we have explained 5 assumptions on preferences, and there is a last one that we addressed on the next slide. This is the assumption of decreasing marginal utility. Before explaining it, it is worth mentioning that if these 6 assumptions are satisfied, then there is always a concave utility function which represents Jenny's preferences. So let's turn to the intuition of the last assumption. Decreasing marginal utility means that the first units of a good increase the level of satisfaction more than, say, the 10th unit of that good. Imagine you are hungry. The first burger you will eat will provide you with a lot of satisfaction. The second one, probably a little bit less. The third one, less than the second one again, and so on. The marginal utility is simply the utility or satisfaction that you derive from one more unit of the good. And the assumption of decreasing marginal utility means that the marginal satisfaction you get from the good, like a burger, decreases as you have more of this good. One remark, we said that it doesn't matter which number the utility function takes, so it doesn't matter where this curve actually lies on the graph. Only the ranking matters. In other words, any transformation of the utility function that preserves the ranking of the bundles is totally fine. You don't have to worry about this. To sum up this podcast, we got an overview of consumer preferences which rely on 6 assumptions. Indifference curves are different levels of utility, and their slope corresponds to the marginal rate of substitution in absolute value. In the next podcasts, we will draw upon the 2 first podcasts in order to answer the question and see what is Jenny's preferred or optimal consumption bundle. Equivalently, what are the optimal quantities of good 1 and good 2 that she will consume given her income and the prices of these goods?